Hey, good morning, everyone. Happy Monday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. We are currently examining and trying to lay the groundwork, trying to set the proper context for understanding the Olivet Discourse. Jesus in Matthew chapter 23 had just pronounced condemnation on the city and on the temple. See, your house is left to you desolate, Matthew 23:37. The disciples immediately began showing Jesus the beauty and the size of the stones, and Jesus said, "Do you not see these things? The time is coming in which not one stone shall be left standing on top of another." And the disciples were just shattered. No pun intended. They were heartbroken. They responded by asking, "Tell us, when shall these things be? What shall be the sign of your coming," the Greek word parousia, "and the end of the age?" As I've shared with you, about 99.9% of all commentators believe that when the disciples asked about these things, fall of Jerusalem, and Jesus is coming in the end of the age, that they mistakenly, confusedly, conflated those two events. It is believed by the great majority of commentators that the disciples were either confused or they were ignorant to associate the fall of Jerusalem with the coming of Jesus and the end of the age. Now, I've shared with you and I've asked you, where would the disciples have ever gotten the idea of the coming of Jesus, a literal, visible, bodily coming of Jesus out of heaven on a physical cloud at the end of the current Christian age? I've been sharing with you, both from the preceding chapters in Matthew, as well as from the Old Testament, that the disciples, number one, were acutely aware of the fact that Jerusalem had been destroyed in the 6th century BC. They knew that it was called the Day of the Lord. They knew that it was not the end of time. Now, those facts are simply indisputable. So the question, therefore, becomes, in the Hebraic mind, in the mind of those first century Jews, when they hear Jesus predicting the fall of Jerusalem, that Jerusalem's going to fall again, what was there in their background? What was there in their knowledge of the Old Testament language that would have caused them to think of a literal, visible, bodily coming of Jesus at some supposed end of time, some supposed end of the Christian age, as a 5'5" Jewish man? We have looked at passage after passage after passage. And by the way, we certainly haven't looked at all of the texts that we could have to show that the disciples were acutely aware of the language of the coming of the Lord on the clouds of heaven, with power, with glory, in flaming fire, in destruction, and heaven and earth being destroyed, in the full knowledge that none of that language was ever fulfilled literally, visibly, and bodily. So once again, where would they have gotten the idea from of a literal physical return of Jesus at the supposed end of time? Now, did you do your homework? Okay? Last Thursday, I gave you some homework to read Isaiah chapter 30 and 31. Let's set the context here. The time is the time period of Hezekiah, the king of Judah and Jerusalem. The Assyrians under King Sennacherib, some say Sennacherib, whatever. The Assyrians, under the leadership of the general in charge of the army, his title was the Rabshakeh, came up against Jerusalem. Now, in the British Museum, which I've been privileged to visit and to see this firsthand, there is a tremendous bas-relief, which is a type of engraving, depicting all of this. Okay? In other words, we have the archaeological confirmation of everything that's said here in Isaiah for us to read. But the Assyrians come up there, and the Rabshakeh stands up before the walls of Jerusalem, and he taunts Hezekiah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem. And he says, look at all the cities that have fallen to us. And they had come into Israel and destroyed 26 cities. Devastated, burned them, totally destroyed them. And so the Rabshakeh says, why do you think you can withstand us? And he chronicled how they had destroyed Egypt. They had destroyed this country. They had destroyed their country. And he said, the gods of those countries could not save them. What makes you think your God can save you from us? Well, needless to say, Hezekiah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem were frightened. The Lord commanded Hezekiah to tell the inhabitants, to tell his warriors, do not fight. Do what? You've got an army out there that wants to invade. They want to kill, they want to rape, they want to plunder and destroy. And Lord, you're telling us not to shoot an arrow, not to throw a spear, not to raise our swords? That's right. And here's a promise that the Lord made. We're going to look at this positively, and then we're going to look at it negatively, for you to see the language that is used here, which is the language with which the apostles were intimately familiar in Matthew chapter 24. Okay, the Lord said that if the inhabitants of Jerusalem, if the armies in Jerusalem would not fight the Assyrians, he said, here's what will happen. There will be on every high hill and on every high mountain rivers and streams of water in the day of the great slaughter when the towers fall. Those probably siege towers. Anyway, now watch this. You just got to catch this. Moreover, now remember, God's saying to Jerusalem, to the armies in Jerusalem, if you will not fight the Assyrians but trust in me and me alone, here's what I will do. And he said, the light of the moon will be as the light of the sun. The light of the sun will be sevenfold as the day of 7 days, as the light of 7 days, in the day that the Lord binds up the bruise of his people and heals the stroke of his wound. Now wait a minute. Folks, what would happen if God made the sun 7 times brighter than it is? Well, the inhabitants of earth would be crispy crittered. That's what would happen. But you see, the sun is a source of blessing. So you multiply that 7 times. This is hyperbolic language. Now, I'm running out of time, so you just simply must realize the nature of Hebraic language. It's poetic. It's hyperbolic. This kind of language was never intended to be taken literally. Now watch. The Lord then turns and says to Jerusalem and to the armies, if you trust in me, if you do not fight, here's what I promise. Isaiah 31, verse 4. Thus the Lord has spoken to me. This is Isaiah speaking. As a lion roars and a young lion over his prey, when a multitude of shepherds is summoned against him, he will not be afraid of their voice, nor be disturbed by their notes. Now watch this. So the Lord of hosts will come down to fight for Mount Zion and for its hill. Like birds flying about, so will the Lord of hosts defend Jerusalem. Defending, he will also deliver it. Passing over, he will preserve it. Now watch this for time. Verse 8. Then Assyria shall fall by a sword not of man, and a sword not of mankind shall devour him. He will flee from the sword, and his young men shall become forced labor. He will cross over to his stronghold for fear, and his princes shall be afraid of the banner, says the Lord, whose fire is in Zion, and whose furnace is in Jerusalem. Okay, So the Lord said he would come out of heaven. He would come with fire. There's a furnace burning in Jerusalem. He would be like, well, let's see it, like a bird fluttering over its nest. And you know, Jesus said, I would have gathered you together as a mother hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you would not. Jesus is recalling the language of Isaiah chapter 31. Well, if it was metaphoric in Isaiah 31, how do we make it any way literal in Matthew 23 and 24? Do you see the point, folks? When the disciples heard of the impending fall of Jerusalem, they knew that when the Lord came in judgment of any nation, then it was said that He came. He came down out of heaven. But you know what? He never came literally, visibly, and bodily. And when you couple that with Jesus' emphatic statement that His coming in judgment was going to be as the Father had come in the past, that's pretty definitive proof that the disciples were not thinking in any way, shape, form, or fashion of Jesus coming as a 5'5" Jewish man riding on cumulus clouds out of heaven at any supposed end of time. It wasn't in their database. So in order to have the disciples asking about a literal, visible, physical bodily coming of Jesus at the supposed end of the Christian age, it is absolutely incumbent upon those who make that claim to prove that God had come that way at some point of time in the past, or to prove that there are Old Testament prophecies of that kind of coming of the Lord, or they must be able to prove that prior to Matthew 24, Jesus had predicted such a coming, and the disciples clearly understood that coming, and they're applying it to what Jesus is saying. Oh, but wait, that would mean they're applying it to the fall of Jerusalem, and that would mean that they really were confused. So that raises the question, were the disciples confused when they asked their question, when shall these things be? What shall be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? And I want to suggest to you folks, it was not those disciples who were confused. It's modern day disciples who read confusion into their question. And we're going to address that on the flip side. I'll see you there.